Hello and welcome to Divinely Empowered with Antonia. Today we have Hans Dietrich, an award-winning graphic designer who made my sign, who likes to research esoteric topics, ancient sites, civilization, and occult symbology. Now, Hans and I met at I'm going to say Conscious Life Expo. I'm not there yet. You're going there though.
I am.
We met at the Promise Revealed in Mount Shasta. And I was fascinated by his talk and we became friends. And here we are. So welcome, Hans.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity to rekindle a friendship and have a great interview. Yay.
Well, thank you for this because this is
Yeah, your sign looks amazing. This is great. I guess this is the first time you're using it now, so yay.
I just used it with Dr. Raymond Keller, but you are, it's the first day, but this format is slightly different. We've changed things around, so it looks even better for you.
Excellent.
Cool. All right, then. So Hans has got so much wisdom and knowledge in his head. I mean, it's overwhelming how much he's researched. He's lived around the world, experienced loads of different cultures. He's sort of American Tibetan, sort of, and just very well traveled ish. But he's got a global knowledge and he's really dug deep into lots of amazing esoteric wisdoms and cultures and all sorts of interesting things. So just tell us some interesting stuff, Hans. How about that?
Sure. I'm what you would call a third culture kid. So I was born in one culture. I was raised in another culture. And through that, I experienced multiculturalism. I grew up in Kathmandu, Nepal from pretty much the age of 4 until I graduated from high school. I went to school with 72 nationalities, about 300 students, K through 12. So not a very big school, but definitely a large family. It's one way to look at it. And as a result of going to school in Nepal, I got to travel all over Asia because we would do sports conventions, band, art, and we'd travel to the international schools in Pakistan. We'd travel to the international schools in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Burma, or Myanmar, whatever we're calling it these days. And so I got to travel a lot when I was younger, and I really appreciated that experience because it kind of opened my mind up to different topics around the world. And so from a very young age, I immersed myself in the magic and mysticism of Nepal, but also got very much into the stories of the Mahabharata, the Purana Vedas. This really sparked a lot of my interest, as well as, cryptids living in Nepal, like the famous Yeti, of course. And so the Yeti is revered in Nepal. It's cross-cultural into China, where it's called the Yeren in central China, which used to be far eastern Tibet. And it's also called the Magoi in Bangladesh, in Bhutan. And so it's fascinating that this character takes on different names, but is described the same way. It's this large, hairy, Himalayan ape man, basically, the Bigfoot of South Asia. And so I was very fascinated by these stories growing up. I ended up going back to Nepal to do a internship 3 years into my university in graphic design and large format printing, while I was waiting for a 2-month special access visa to Bhutan, where my father was working, and I was going to do my thesis there on Buddhist cultural mysticism, ancient art, and architecture of Bhutan. But while I was there, I started getting into a lot of the mysticism of Buddhism, because in Bhutan, they practice a sect of Buddhism called Nyingma Buddhism. And this is where we get all the stories of levitation, of ascended Tulku masters, of astral projection, Mount Meru, spiritual dimensions. This all comes out of this one sect of Buddhism, where a lot of the other sects of Buddhism, they don't really talk a lot about these topics. And so I started getting very intrigued along the way. And then, I got back to university and I ended up going straight into my career. And a couple of years ago, a fellow researcher challenged me to look into the story of the Dropa. And I went into it, shameless plug here, yay. I went into it with, as I do a lot of my research, my BS meter completely in the red. A couple hundred questions. I set out not necessarily to debunk it, but I set out to see what I could find out about this story and see what direction it took me. And I started realizing that there was this huge overlap in the story with my thesis work that I had done in Bhutan, because there's a nomadic tribe of Bhutanese that travel from far eastern Tibet, which is now central China, all the way through South Asia up into the Caspian and Black Sea area. And across this dimensional plane, in a sense, their name transliterates. And so in Far Eastern Tibet, they're known as the Dropa. In Central Tibet, they're known as the Zopa. When you get into Bhutan and northern India and Nepal, they're known as the Drokpa, or the people of the cloud dragons. And then the further west that you go, they become the Brokpa. And so it's interesting because they're incredibly nomadic now, but during, prior to 1950, they lived in this far eastern region of Tibet around the Bayan Karaula, Bayan Harshan mountain ranges. This is kind of where the Yellow or the Yangtze and the Yalong rivers start. This is where their headwaters are. And this mountain range is littered with caves. And so in these caves over centuries of time have been found mummified remains like the Terram mummies, which are considered to be from around 4000 BC. They're perfectly preserved because the arid air of this region is pretty cold and dry. And so things don't rot. And so, the remains of people have definitely been mummified in this area. They found religious documents, scrolls, artifacts, and petroglyphs in these caves. And also the remains of this mysterious race of people known as the Dropa. And so I started really getting into this story because it's like there's not a lot of information out there at all. And the information that's available on it is the same information over and over and over again that's just been, chewed up, redigested, and spit out. And so my research basically was to find out where the origins of these stories were coming from and what all I could find out, because as the story goes, in 1938, there is a group of cultural archaeologists that have come from the Beijing Academy of Sciences, and they're looking for remains and religious scriptures and whatnot in these caves in this remote area of what was then Tibet, but now is considered central China. In one of the caves, they're mesmerized because the cave is hewn out of the bedrock, like straight cut walls, straight cut ceiling, straight cut floors. On one of the walls is the sun and the moon as a petroglyph. In the center is the star system of Canis Major, which has Sirius as the brightest star. And from Sirius is a dotted line coming to a mountain range. In the back of the caves, they found row upon row of mummified and skeletal remains of a race of people that are about 4 foot tall at best, a little bit over a meter, right? Slightly elongated heads. What's remaining of their flesh is this orangish colored flesh and blue-green eyes. And so this is incredibly rare for any people in this region because you just don't see blue eyes and this orangish, skin tone. And so at the back of the cave, they found one disc buried with these bodies that had a hole in the center, very similar to this. This is a Chinese bai disc. So it has a hole in the center, right? And spiraling out from the center is a glyphic writing that these archaeologists do not recognize. The main archaeologist, his name is Chipute, but I do not believe this is actually his name. I think it's a transliterated name. And transliteration was a huge part of the story that I discovered. For those who don't know, transliteration is when you hear something in one language and you try and transcribe it into your language to describe to other people what you've heard. And so in a sense, it's an intellectual game of telephone. Basically, you hear things differently. And so when you start looking at the word like Dropa, it also becomes Drokpa and Brokpa and Zopa. These are all transliterated versions of the same name that someone else has heard and has transliterated into something else. So along with this one disc that had these glyphic writings, they find 716 other discs. They take some of the materials back with them to the Beijing Academy of Sciences for further testing. About 20 years later, so this is about 10 years after the Chinese invaded Tibet in 1950. So in 1958, another professor at the Beijing Academy of Sciences cracks the code and he translates this alien language on the disc, which I honestly don't think is an alien language based on what the translation says. But in his work and in the story that's out there, he says that it basically claims that a race of people came from Sirius 20,000 years ago, crash landed on Earth, or sorry, it would be 10,000 years ago, crash landed on Earth, and were unable to get help and go back to their, civilization at Sirius. And so they were forced to intermingle and interbreed with the local Kham Marase or Kham Tibetans. And so this is where this story starts to get really interesting. They speak, well, I can get into that a little bit, but they speak of this race, coming here basically. And Sung Ung Nui, the second professor, gets laughed out of the Beijing Academy of Sciences because nobody believes this story. And so one of the discs from the collection, we don't know if any of them, other than the one, had writing on them. We just don't know this from the story. But one of the discs ends up in Russia and the Soviet Union for further testing. And so they do mineralogical testing on it, and they do oscillation testing on it. And it's interesting because there's a documentary out there where a lot of this information comes from called the UFO Files. It's episode 15 or something, I believe. It came out in 2005. And so what's interesting is in the documentary, the three guys that are doing the research on this subject kind of joke that, these people had large and clumsy heads, and there's all this stuff. And when they were doing oscillation testing on the disc, they must have put it on a turntable and tried to play it, and this is how they figured out the oscillation of it. Well, that's not how you do oscillation testing. You basically would connect electrodes to it and pulse it with electricity and see if it retains a resonance. And so when they got the mineralogical tests back, they realized that it was made out of jadeite. So my disc here is made out of jade. This is like a softer red jade. I don't actually know what the translation of this is. I would like to find that out one of these days. But jadeite is more like granite. And so it has jade crystalline mass within it, but it's more like a granite style rock, which means that if it's put under pressure, it will create a piezoelectric effect. And what's interesting with what they discovered was there's cobalt and mercury infused within the disc. And so it would retain a charge like a battery, which is what they discovered through the oscillation testing. And so the thought is this item has come from somewhere where it's been around vast amounts of electricity. And so it made the story even more interesting. And so then these researchers said, well, this story comes out of, an interesting storyline. Basically, in 1962, there were 3 publications that were made. The first publication was called UFO, or the Belgian UFO Bulletin. Vegetarian Universe was the second one, and the third one was Sputnik magazine. And so Vegetarian Universe is a German publication. The Belgian UFO Bulletin is a Belgian publication, and Sputnik is a Russian or Soviet publication. And they usually get into these esoteric, topics. In 1968, however, this story supposedly ended up in Chariots of the Gods, Eric Van Daniken's groundbreaking work. And so I went, aha, I have a place to start looking, right? But these researchers were very skeptical of the story because, as they say, Chipute is not a Chinese name. Well, it isn't, and I think it's a transliterated name. I'll get into that in a second. So Unui is not a Chinese name. It isn't. I think it's also a transliterated name. The Beijing Academy of Sciences does not exist. The Dropa people on Dropa stones do not exist. And so they're basically, at the end of this documentary, saying that they can't find enough research to claim that the story is real or not. And so this is where I jump in with my research. And so I start looking for these 3 publications. Well, I have not been able to find a single edition, publication, or date or article in any magazine called Vegetarian Universe. Doesn't exist. I have not been able to find a publication, a date, or anything related to the Belgian UFO Bulletin. So this, in my research, also doesn't exist. And what's great about Sputnik magazine is you can find from about 1960 onward every publication that they've ever put out in PDF form on their archives. And so I went through every publication from 1962 looking for this article. Could not find it. So I'm like, all right, well, it's got to be in Chariots of the Gods. This is coming from this documentary and these 3 amazing researchers, Richard Dolan, David Serrata, and Hartwig Hausdorff are the 3 researchers in the documentary. And it's interesting because all of a sudden I'm looking through Chariots of the Gods and it's not in there either. So how are they coming to this conclusion that this story is coming out of these publications when I'm not finding any relation to these publications? So I kept looking, and I found a 1965 edition of what is called UFO Nachrichten in German, which means UFO bulletin. And I went, maybe this is the source of the UFO bulletin from Belgium, because as we know, Belgium and Germany speak the same language. And so I started reading through the translation of this. So we have a Chinese story being translated into German and then German into English. And it's interesting because it goes through the story of Chipute finding the device, of Sun Nui translating it, of what his translation said, but then it also has the translation in the article. And the article starts off saying this is a republication from Vegetarian Universe, but it doesn't give a publication, it doesn't give a date. And so it's just this name that's out there that I think everybody's kind of attached to the story, is this Vegetarian Universe publication, which I don't actually think exists. The translation says that the Dropa came down from the clouds in their winged gliders 10 times before the sun set. The villagers, the locals, had to hide in the caves until they realized that this time the Dropa came with peaceful intentions. And so in the documentary, you know, one of the reasons why they call it a hoax, and this is why I don't think they've done a lot of research into this, was because you can't translate an alien language without a cipher. Well, if you listen to what the translation says, it's not coming from the observation of an alien species. It's coming from the observation of the villagers in the region. And so it could be translated because it would be of a different language, whether it's Sanskrit, Tibetan, or this language called Shina, which is what the Dropa or Dropa people of Bhutan speak. And Shina it's like a 6,000 BC or older language.
Wow.
It has a female and male voice to it, kind of like Thai or Spanish. So there's a female voice and a male voice, and it has a hierarchy to it. So there's a child's tongue, the common tongue, and then the royal tongue. And so it's probably spoken by less than 600 people in the world. There's 3 dialects of it. There's Brokskot, Brokot, and Minoriscot. And so these 3 languages are kind of scattered between central China and all the way to the Caspian and Black Sea area. And so I believe that the language on the disc was one of these languages, which to somebody in China would look very alien compared to their own glyphic writing and their own script. I didn't give up there, so I kept looking, and I found a 1967 publication from, I believe, July of 1967 from Sputnik magazine, and it was in French. And so the article is called "Des Visiteurs du Cosmos," the cosmic visitors. And it almost verbatim from the French translation into English is the same story that's in UFO Nachrichten, except instead of intermixing with the Kham Tibetan, it says they intermixed with the Ham Chinese. Well, there is no group or cultural group in China called the Ham, H-A-M. There's the Han, as in the Han Dynasty, but there isn't anybody called the Ham. And so this just pickled my interest even more because, you know, we have all these transliterations. So Kham becomes Ham, so on and so forth. I started looking at Chipute. I'm like, it sounds an awful lot like Shifu Te. And Shifu is a Chinese name. It's a title. It means teacher or master. And so if he's a professor of archaeology from the Beijing Academy of Sciences, he's going to be known as Master Te. So when I looked up what Te is as a surname, right there in the research, it says a Western transliteration of a popular Chinese name, Techu. And so this is why I say in my research, I started with my BS meter in the red, and it's totally shattered at this point because here I am discovering all this information about this topic that these renowned researchers hadn't even found. And so the story that's out there online is the continuation of all this same story over and over again. But in my own research, you know, I tied it into a lot of what I've been doing with my own thesis work, a lot what I've been doing with my own multicultural experiences and with my art, and started discovering a lot more to this story. And so, as you held it up earlier, a lot of that is in my book. Dropa, Legends and Lore, connecting the ancient secrets of Bhutan, China, Nepal, Tibet, and Sirius. Because Sirius keeps coming up in Buddhist philosophy. There's a lot of connections to Sirius with ancient Buddhist stories, ascended Tulku masters especially, and there's this connection with the Dropa and Sirius. And so this is one of the great topics that I love to talk about. And I'm doing a huge lecture in October next month in Las Vegas.
Viva Las Vegas.
Right. I have two topics that I'll be speaking of. So the first day, I think it's the first day, or it's the second day, so it'll be Friday. I'm speaking about the Dropa, and I'll go into more detail, obviously, in my lecture than I'm doing here, but connecting all these dots and these two, cultural systems. And then the next day in the morning, on Saturday morning, I'm speaking on the Lost Mysteries of Kemet, which is the book I just finished. Yay! And so I dive into the mysteries of Kemet, because Kemet is basically Egypt before the Greeks conquered it. And most of what we know about Egypt today, this is one of my lectures was on Symbology of Kemetology, but this is pretty much the same idea that's going into my book. What we learn today about Egypt, all of it comes from the Greeks. So the Greeks came in, they conquered in 323 BC with Alexander the Great, and then they rewrote most of Egypt's history to mimic a lot of their own history. And so all the names that we get in Egypt, Isis, Osiris, all the Ramses, all these names are Greek names. So Isis, her original name was Aset, and Osiris, his original name was Wasir. And Ramses was Ramasu, which means the rebirth of the sun. And so I go into a lot of the Cometian cosmology, a lot of what comes out of their own Suf language, because the Suf language was one of the first languages before Arabic came in. And it's still spoken in Algeria and Morocco, but it's this older, it's kind of like a Greco-Arabic language in a sense, but it's much older.
Religion too, isn't it? Sufi.
It's different. Sufi is very different.
Oh, is it different? Okay.
Yeah, so the Sufi come out of Iran, but I mean, there's an interesting, correlation with the name, because Kemet, we look at Egypt as this little tiny country. Kemet stretched all the way from the Atlantic Ocean all the way up into the Mediterranean, into where we see Lebanon and Syria today. And so the Cometians were the Phoenicians. I mean, it's the same group of people. And so all of that land in between would have been considered Kemet. Kemet comes from a Suf word that means the fertile or black soil. And so this is what happens when the Nile floods every year. It brings in all this alluvial silt that floods into the farmlands, and then all the crops are grown based off of that. And so this is the black soil of the Nile. But yeah, so I get into a lot of the Egyptian cosmology. I talk about the sacred houses of ancient Egypt, which is the most fascinating, because we're told that the pyramids were all tombs, but even in the Suf language, they're telling us that they're called pernetter, and per is a house. It's always it's like a broken box with a symbol in it, and the netter is basically, it's either an axe head or a flag. Well, pernetter means the house of nature, or the house of an aspect of nature. This is what the pyramids were. Per-ka, this is the house of the body. That's a tomb. Okay, so the per-ka is a tomb or a mastaba, where the pernetter is a pyramid. And the Greeks knew this. They weren't dumb. And
what were they for? What were the pyramids for?
Pyramidos, the fire in the middle. So it's an energy device, right? It's there creating energy. And if you look at what it's made out of, I mean, the Great Pyramid is made out of a lot of interior rooms are all granite, this rose granite from Aswan, about 500 miles to the south. And then it's surrounded by, several 100,000 blocks of limestone. Well, granite doesn't conduct electricity, but limestone does. And so you're basically creating a capacitor with the building blocks of the Great Pyramid. And so under all that pressure, you would get like a piezoelectric effect. And if you could amplify that with hydrogen or with other chemicals that were being poured into the Queen's chamber, we assume, or we think, it would create an internal combustion like a generator that would continually create this energy. And then the energy would spread out from the pyramids across, part of the land, kind of like geomancy or terraforming in a sense. And so looking at the pyramids very differently, you've got to start looking at everything else very differently. And so the high house is called Per-ah. And this is where the word pharaoh comes from. And so we're all told that the pharaohs were all these kings that ruled the land. Well, Per-ah is the high house of the woman. And so this is where the word pharaoh comes from. And so there were no male pharaohs. They were all the priestesses of Hatshepsut, of Aset and of Hathor, and they would choose their consorts who would become their kings, and they would rule the land together as a unity project. And so you always see in the statues in the museums, the women will have their arms around the man. This is mine, not the other way around. Hey, baby, you know. And so it's always shown that there's this respect between, you know, the female position, the woman's role of the house, and the man's role of the house. And it's fascinating because in this unity project, the woman rules over the fertility of the land and the people, where the man, the king, rules over the land and the people physically. And so this is where this unity comes together, basically. So that's what my other lecture will be on in Las Vegas. So getting deep into a lot of that and a lot of the mysteries of what we see in Egypt, because when you go to some of these sites on these tours, again, my BS meter in the red and hundreds of questions, it's just once you're in the field and you're looking at these sites,
they're huge.
They're huge, and they don't make sense. They don't make any sense. It's like, what is going on?
I mean, the stories that you get on a tour in Egypt they just sound very, I mean, they're still saying slaves are the ones that built them with all this amazing, I mean, the geometry, it's just, you know, it's better than we can do with
our tools today.
We can't do them. And they discovered some new bits, didn't they, when they had to use fiber optics and they had to put fiber optic cables through different little channels. And that's recent, isn't it? Yeah,
in the Queen's Chamber, they put this robot, it's called Gantenbrink's robot, and they put it up inside the tunnel that was discovered in the Queen's Chamber. And it went up a couple meters and it came to a wall. And hanging out of the wall are two pieces of copper wire that have since eroded off. And so they drilled a hole through and put the fiber optic camera through and found another room in this. I mean, the shaft isn't very big. And so they found another room inside of that had another wall or door. And so inside of there was writing. They don't know what the writing is. It's in a red ochre. So they don't really know how old the structure is, how old any of it is, which is pretty amazing because if you look at the Giza Plateau, you can see vast amounts of water damage. There's water damage on the Sphinx enclosure. Yeah. There's water damage on all three of the pyramids, about 3/4 of the way up. I mean, if you're standing there, you can obviously see it. And so the question is, was there a massive flood? Which makes the other question, how old are these structures? You know.
Sounds very Graham Hancock.
Yeah, very much so. And but he's been, you know, proven right time and time again. I mean, everything just keeps getting older and older and older. We keep finding stuff.
But they're not admitting that. Are they still? I know a few years ago when I was last looking into this, the professor of Egyptology was Muslim and was very anti anyone aging the pyramids.
Zahi Hawass, yes,
is he dead yet?
And they were slaves.
Is that still a thing, or is it?
He kind of got booted. He got in a little bit of trouble because he was taking artifacts out of Egypt and putting them on tours around the world without, you know, the consent of UNESCO and all, you know, because they're all heritage pieces and whatnot. And so he kind of got removed from being the high antiquity minister of Egypt. But nothing gets done there without his approval, even today. So even though he doesn't have that job, they still have to go through him and his office to, you know, get archaeological permits. A lot of them are denied because they don't want people digging around. They've done ground penetrating radar from satellites and discovered massive structures in the Western Desert, which used to be called the Ur-Nile. There was a huge form of water there after the Halcyon Comet event pushed water up and over from the Mediterranean into the northern jungles of North Africa, which then became desert, basically, because of all the silt. It dried out the land, and that water system now sits underneath the Libyan desert. There's a huge, vast water aquifer that's left over from this. But it's interesting when they're doing these radar scans, they're finding structures out in the desert. And so it's like, what else is out there? Are there more pyramids? You know, are there older structures?
Aren't they? The pyramids are all around every continent has found pyramids allegedly.
Yeah.
Which is pretty wild that they're just a feature. Where do you think they're from? Do you think they're Lemurian or Atlantean or there's a Tartarian?
they're all built similarly but differently. And this is what's fascinating. Some of them are natural land formations that have been retrodden, like for instance the Bosnian pyramids. These weren't built, but they were re-sculpted, I think. Right up north here for me is a place called Tum Tum Mountain. And Tum Tum Mountain is called a cinder cone because I live in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. There's a lot of volcanic activity out here. And so all the mountains, literally from Vancouver, BC, all the way down to California to Shasta, where we were at, they're all volcanic mountains. And so in the middle of nowhere, it's up this river. It's about an hour off the freeway as you head up to Seattle. It's a little over an hour outside of Portland, where I'm living. Is this Tum Tum Mountain. And when you drive up to it, it looks like a pyramid. And you can hike up it. It's all been terraced at some point in the ancient past. And then later was used for forestry projects. So they would plant trees and cut them all down. But the whole hillside is terraced. And I find that incredibly fascinating. The Native Americans used it as a landmark for trading. So they would put up their trading posts around it because it's the only thing in the area. There's like these rolling hills and then this pyramid. And it looks like a pyramid. But again, it's a natural formation that has been resculpted. But then, like you said, they found pyramids literally on every continent. And so I find that incredibly fascinating because what was the structure? And as you said, were they Lemurian? Were they Atlantean? I have an interesting thought of Atlantis. Primarily, we were talking Graham Hancock and previous civilizations. So this race of Dropa, who supposedly came 12,000 years ago, and this is during the time of the last ice age, during the Younger Dryas. Which is interesting because Earth was very different back then. And because of the Halcyon Comet impact event, which took us back into the Younger Dryas, into a mini ice age, a lot of humanity and a lot of mega fauna and mega flora were killed off as a result. So humanity would have been back to sticks and stones in a sense. And so the civilizations that existed before that would have been what I call the time of Atlantis. Because we're all told, oh, Atlantis was one place and it sank into the seas. But if you actually read the Critias and the other book that Plato wrote, he talks about there being 5 capitals that were stretched around the entire world. So this is a global civilization. And so during the Ice Age, the oceans would have been a lot shallower, 400, 500, 600 feet shallower. So there could have been a lost continent of Mu in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that now is just a bunch of islands scattered all over the place. If you take the ocean levels down 500, 600 feet, most of those island groups would have connected, through mountain ranges all the way across the Pacific in a sense. And so this is the idea of, Mu or Lemurians and whatnot because of the lemur monkeys that were found. This is where this whole, lemur Lemuria aspect comes from. But then we also have these connections to all this, volcanic activity and volcanic rocks, volcanic lava tubes like on Hawaii or at Shasta, and so there's this interesting connection that maybe some of this technology had been left over from a previous civilization and then was found, like a lot of the structures in Egypt or Peru. They were found by the cultures that then inherited those lands. And they all say, we didn't build any of this. This was long before we were, but they take ownership to it, right?
What do you think about the pyramids in Antarctica?
I've seen photos. I'm not entirely sure, because none of us can actually go down there. I'd love to pick Brad Olson's brain on that one since he's been to Antarctica, but he was on a cruise. I don't know. They look massive. They look a lot larger than what we see in Egypt. And from what I hear, the Alaskan pyramid as well, even though it's buried underground, is also a lot larger than the Great Pyramid. So to me, that's interesting because you start looking at other pyramids around the world and you've got like 150 pyramids in China that they're starting to discover now, thanks to satellite photography. And a lot of them have a footprint that's a little bit larger than the Great Pyramid as well. And so who was building these things? What was their purpose? And when?
Yeah, what do you think it was then? What do you think the purpose is? Just as an electrical generator then, or what?
Well, considering they're on every continent and almost every country, back in the ancient days, there weren't borders or boundaries or countries. So it's like, this is kind of a mystery in itself. were we terraforming Earth to make it more hospitable for us?
Well, do you know what? I think there must be something in that, because I know the Bosnian pyramids, didn't they cut the side off it or the top off it to use it as building materials, and the weather changed quite significantly in the area. There was evidence around that, and it could be that it's calming down weather in certain locations, because I built myself a little pyramid before, out of, you're supposed to either do it all inorganic or all organic materials. You're not supposed to mix metal and wood. So I put epoxy and wood together, and it was like 73 degrees, and it was and I could sit in it. It was tall enough for me to sit in it. It's very intense being in that energy. I had to break it down because I was getting ulcers, because I'm always connected to source and doing energy work constantly, but it literally, it was too speedy for me, because I'm already kind of at capacity with the energy work that I'm doing. But apparently it does all sorts of things, like sharpens razors, and, can get people who are on acid completely sober in a few moments. They're sitting inside pyramids. It has all sorts of effects. And the interesting one was about the Russian babies who were born prematurely. And they gave them some pyramid water. Well, initially they were giving them medicine, then they ran out, and then just gave them pyramid water, and they seemed to actually survive at a rate which they shouldn't have. So there's some medicinal properties in it. It keeps food fresh, like a fridge for a long time. It's sort of an energy generator in some way, and certainly for me, it was too much of an energy generator that I had to break it.
Well, yeah, there was the Russians did a whole bunch of studies on pyramid power. Basically,
is fascinating, because the Russians, what happened after the Cold War, for anyone who's unaware of this, I'm sure you know, Hans, but the Russians after the Cold War, what they did was have loads of scientists and nothing really to build, because they'd stopped being at war with America and thought, well, what do we do? And instead of sending them back to go and work in the supermarket, they thought, they gave them the budget, kept them where they were, and said, you go and investigate some interesting things. And so a lot of the esoteric wisdom has come from Russia, because they went and researched all these things, which there was never a budget for, but they decided just to do it. So Russia's really the place to learn a lot of science and esoteric stuff merged together.
Well, and we have like Nicholas Roerich, he was Russian as well, but he worked in the United States, and he worked in India. And so he was sent to India in the early 1900s to help as an engineer build some of the monasteries for the Buddhist monks, basically. And legend says that he was handed a piece of the Sintamani stone and was asked to bring it back to the sacred city of Shambhala. And so in the 1930s, the Minister of Interior of the United States, his name was Wallace, underneath President Eisenhower, or was it Roosevelt? It was under Roosevelt's administration, hired Nicholas Roerich to find these esoteric knowledges in Tibet and northern India. And so this is, early 1930s. The Russians were doing.
It was after all of that stuff too, wasn't he?
The Germans were doing the same thing. You have Madame Blavatsky, right? Helena Blavatsky. She's also from Russia. She was a theosophist, and so she was into all this esoteric knowledge. And then her predecessor was Alice Bailey. And then we have Alexandria Neal, who was a French esoterist as well. And so they're all in this area, of the world looking for the secrets, the ancient secrets.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how much, esoteria comes out of a lot of Russian research and information. They were taking stones and putting them inside of these pyramids that they were building. And then they would take the stones, and the stones would be like the corner or foundation stone in a jail that they would build. And they were testing to see basically the mentality of the prisoners being around these stones that have been charged up in these pyramids, and really interesting stuff. They were germinating seeds. They were growing all sorts of these seeds that were super large. My cousin built one here for his garden. He just wanted to, test it out, and started growing broccoli under it. And the broccoli shot up and, grew so much quicker and so much larger than it normally would without this. He made it out of PVC, but it was like a PVC pyramid. And so there's definitely something to it. So if you're building these all around the world, and most of them are on these geomagnetic spots or ley lines, there's definitely something going on there. And a lot of them are next to water or sources of water. And so you have this, natural electrical grid line of the earth and then water. What are you actually creating with the energy from these things? Because that is what's really fascinating. You're charging up the water to some degree. And so you're bringing life, you're terraforming. And that is the ultimate question. It's like, why were we terraforming the earth? Are we not from here? I mean,
that's an interesting idea, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we're the only creatures that wear clothes, and have
we're definitely not from here. I love Lloyd Pye's Everything You Think You Know Is Wrong. I think that's a fascinating documentary because we don't fit here at all. But what's interesting saying that, I was when you were talking about how the Dropa look, I just had a flash of the movie June with the piercing blue eyes.
Right.
And it just it just made me think, is it maybe Earth was like that, like June was, and that's why we've had to build the pyramids to terraform it. I don't know. It just sort of, there was a crossover in my mind just because of her piercing blue eyes. And as you said, the Dropa looked.
Well, that's interesting because when you get into the stories of the Mahabharata, so the Mahabharata is known as the Great 18-Day War. It's a 100,000 verse epic Indian tale. But if you cut through all that and you get down to the core of it, it's an incredibly science fiction-esque tale. So what it's telling us is at some point in the past, our sun burped or erupted, which it goes through different cycles of doing. And the elites on our planet built these space arcs, basically, to leave. And it says that they go to this place called Mahar, which if you look up Mahar, in Vedic terminology, it's considered the fourth density from the sun. So this is a planet. This is Mars, possibly. Might not even be in our solar system. We don't know. But they leave Earth and they go to this planet and they stay there for several thousand years. While they're there, they grow in height because the gravity is different. Their skin color changes because the lighting is different. Their eyes change. Their hair becomes this auburn red. Their skin becomes like a blue, like Shiva or Krishna. Their eyes become this blue, or their skin becomes, orange or red, just really depending, what their origin was. And they come back to Earth to repopulate Earth, only to realize that humanity on Earth had survived the solar outburst. And so this is the Great War. It's the return of the gods fighting the demigods and the humans for the land, the Great War of the land. And it's interesting what they talk about, because they're talking about guided weaponry, lasers, atomic beings or automaton beings, AI beings like this character Barbarak. And Krishna lobs his head off, and his head is just sitting on the ground laughing at Krishna while his body is still fighting Krishna. And he's like, you can't kill me. I'm not even alive. I'm a robot. So it's talking about robotic technologies. And then
they duplicate as well. They replicate, because some of I went to Shiva's cave and he gave me his weapons. And some of them is really interesting because a lot of them do replicate. And when you do energy work and you're working against demons or slaying demons, one of the things that they do when you kill them, and it's very Medusa-esque, they, you kill them and then there's replications of them. As soon as their blood hits the ground, more of them are born. And that's really interesting. Yeah, no, it happens. It happens a lot. And then we were like, oh, okay, so why is that? How is that? Why are they replicating all the time? Because we're seeing it when we're working on them. And then we're trying to work back and trying to figure out how that is, why that is, what that is. And then we looked into some of the weapons of Shiva, and there's one thing which it catches everything. It's almost like you cut off their head and then you put something down, you catch them. So that the blood doesn't hit the ground, and then they can't replicate, and you have to sort of do things in a few different parts. And that's what we've experienced as well. So it's really interesting because the way that he was battling demons, we're using some of his techniques, because with the blanks in our knowledge, okay, what the hell do you do? If you kill them, you get 10 more. Shit. Right. What do you do?
This is like the legend of the dragon scales, right? If you plant a dragon scale in the ground, it'll pop up another, dragon warrior or dragon.
You have to put something on the ground. You have to put something on the ground which catches the blood, and the blood doesn't hit. But it's the same with Medusa as well. I remember that, like, the blood goes in the.
Well, she's a Naga, and I think that's interesting because the Nagas come up a lot in Buddhist philosophy, the Nagas are half reptile and half human. And so what is Medusa? Well, she's half snake and half human, right? And so you have these Nagas popping up in movies and historical references. Often they're guarding the gates of Shambhala, deep within the core of the earth, the sacred city of Shambhala. There's reference to them amongst the kings of Bhutan, like the first Druk Gyalpo king. His name was Jurgen Wanchu. So Druk is a cloud dragon in the Bhutanese language. So Druk Gyalpo is the king of the cloud dragon. So he's the first cloud dragon king.
Hardcore.
But he also has a Dropa or Shina name, and it is Deb Nagpo. So here's Nagpo, the flying serpent king. It's right there in his title. And so it's interesting that in Buddhist philosophy, you see a lot of these Nagas depicted where they have the serpent body, but then the head of a deity or the upper torso of a deity. So it's like, we see this in a lot of statues as well. And so it's like, where are these ideas of these serpent people coming from?
Do you think that they were genetically engineered? Do you think they come from a different galaxy? Where do you think that these what are they? Chimeras? Is it, no, how do you pronounce it?
Chimera, yeah.
Chimera, yeah. Where do you think they're from? Do you think they're made?
I have no idea. Yeah. It could be us, fooling around with science in the past. I mean, we're doing this all over again right now. We're messing with genetics and we're messing with science, and we don't know what the outcome's going to be. I mean, they're making glow-in-the-dark pigs for, it's just like, why? What is
because they can. That's the problem with science. Because they can becomes a good enough reason to be experimenting with.
Everybody wants to play God. So yeah, no, that's interesting, huh? So yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe we, did not originate here. Maybe we did need to terraform this planet. Maybe, as Graham Hancock puts it, we are a civilization with amnesia. Because if you look at wars and what war does, if we've been at war, for instance, for the last 6,000 years, whoever wins the war writes the new history, right?
His story.
Right. Okay. And so it's usually only half of the truth. Okay. So if you do this math and you start half-lifing all these wars, after 128 wars, we have no history on this planet. None.
Sounds very Battlestar Galactica, though, doesn't it?
Right. It's like, where do we come from? And that's interesting, because what did we do in Battlestar Galactica? We made these automaton beings to be our servants, and then they rebelled against us. And these were the Cylons. And so, yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, but then they ended up, repopulating Earth at the end, didn't they?
Right, because they were trying to find their lost tribe, their lost world. And so, yeah, that there's a lot of that, and there's a lot that goes into science fiction that could be, science fact or historical to some degree. We just don't know, again, because we keep finding stuff. We're trying to shove it into the 7,000 year timeline, and a lot of it is going further and further and further and further back. And so the question is, okay, how long have we been on this planet? How long have we been more of a modern civilization? How many rises and falls have there been, in the course of history that we don't even know about? I mean, we know the planet goes through its rises and falls, but I'm sure we do as well as, beings that live here. All creatures do, in a sense. So yeah, no, I think that's incredibly fascinating.
So where are you going to be talking then? You've got some conferences upcoming.
So in October, I'll be in Las Vegas. As I said, I'll be at Alien Event and Biomed Expo. And so I'll be talking about the Dropa and the lost mysteries of Kemet. I was just in LA in April, and I spoke about what my second book was about. We didn't actually get into that, but I'll shout on that really quick. And so it's the magic of symbols. And so
let's have another session about.
Of course. Oh no, of course. There's a lot there. And so I talk a lot about symbology and corporate symbology and symbology in movies. And then, so I'm not going to be talking about this time, but then my second conference is in February. I got invited to speak at Conscious Life Expo, and so
that's the biggie. That's the biggie.
I have a 90-minute lecture Friday the 7th at noon in the Rabbit Hole Room in Los Angeles, and so that's going to be incredibly exciting. Conscious Life Expo brings a lot of people to it, And so I'm incredibly honored to be able to speak there and looking forward to it, because I love coming to these conventions because I get to meet new people and, you know, find my family and meet people like you. And so, yeah, no, it's incredible. So
have we got any final words of wisdom? Anything you want to share with everybody?
Wow, good question. Keep researching. This is the key. And, you know, the internet is an amazing thing. We're all armchair tourists or armchair researchers. But if you have the opportunity to go to some of these ancient sites, whether it be Peru, whether it be Mexico, whether it be India, whether it be Egypt, or elsewhere, Cambodia, any of these amazing ancient sites, go. Do not hesitate. You know, things will come together, even if you can't afford it. You'd be amazed at what you can actually put together and make happen through powers of manifestation. And so I suggest everybody, you know, get out in the field, go research some of these topics. You will be blown away, because what you see on TV and what you see in other people's documentaries is not what you experience going to these sites in reality. So you can find out about some of my amazing adventures at megalithic.mysteries.com. You can also pick up both of my books there. They were self-published through Lulu. And my third book on the lost mysteries of Kemet will be coming out here shortly. I just finished it. I'm going through the editing process, and I'm going to get some printed and hopefully have them when I'm in Las Vegas, but I'll definitely have them when I'm in LA. So, yeah.
I want to go to Göbekli Tepe. That one is just like winking at me. Oh, you allowed it?
Göbekli Tepe and Karen Tepe, the other one they just found near there.
I want to go to them. They're winking at me.
It's sad though, and you know, Jimmy Corsetti talks about this, that they will not allow any new excavations there for the next 100 to 150 years, which is sad. And they planted trees over part of the unexcavated areas, and they've paved a road over part of it as well. And so the only thing that you see at Göbekli Tepe is about 5% of what's actually there, buried underneath the ground, and what you see is huge. And so why don't they want to show us this? You know, it's fascinating that it's even there. And we're told that hunters and gatherers built this site, and it's like, there's no way. You would need a civilization just to support the workers, you know. So it's mind blowing, and it's definitely on my bucket list. I would love to go see Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
All right. So, well, thank you very much, Hans, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Fascinating. I think we need to go more into detail about some of these different.
Oh, we definitely will. This is more of an introductory.
This is an introduction. I think we'll do a little Hans series.
That would be great. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, that'd be really fun. I think so. And if anyone has any questions, just put them in the comments below, and we can find out more about Hans's just encyclopedic wisdom. It's it really is. It's just like, whoa, there's so much information you're retaining.
I don't know how I keep it all stored upstairs, especially
I don't know either, but you
speaking about 4 different topics at a lecture, and people are like, how do you remember all this stuff? I do.
Yeah, you've got a good memory. All right. Well, thank you so much, Hans, for joining me. And thank you everyone for watching my Divinely Empowered podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Yeah, cheers.
And recording.